and fulfill our vision. While I loved that job, I finally realized that I was ready to go do some of the things that we were advocating for. I was tired of just talking about it. Fortunately, I happened to know someone who had just been named commissioner of a state that was one of the first recipients of Race to the Top. And he needed someone to lead the implementation of that grant. So I moved to Nashville and led the Tennessee Race to the Top work for 3 years with Kevin Huffman, and have been at the department now for 5 years. So as interesting as moving from federal policy to the classroom was when I joined the Corps, moving from federal policy to state implementation of federal policy was really fascinating. I have to admit, when I was working in federal policy, I often felt like that was the end of the line. We write the policy, we pass the law, and then people do what the policy says. Poof, change. It sounds crazy when I say it out loud, but I think a lot of times we think of policy as passing a law or engaging in advocacy. But I learned over the years of implementing Race to the Top that the law, the policy, is just the first step. It's an important first step, don't get me wrong, and it needs to be done incredibly thoughtfully, but it's just the first step. And what was really going to determine whether or not Race to the Top changed things for kids was the not-so-sexy work of implementation on the ground. And in fact, we saw this play out. We saw some states get Race to the Top grants, and over the course of that grant, see dramatic results for students. And we saw other states get Race to the Top, and over the course of that grant, didn't see the same kind of results with their students. Now, I won't use my pulpit here to brag on Tennessee, but I feel like, for my credibility's sake, I should tell you all that Tennessee saw pretty dramatic increases in student achievement over the course of our Race to the Top work. I learned that implementation. Thank you. I learned that implementation matters, and good implementation requires making hundreds of policy decisions day in and day out, some big, some small, to really move the needle. And frankly, this was a form of policy that I hadn't really considered before. There are a couple of key things about our experience in Tennessee that I think made a difference for us. First, having good policies doesn't matter if the programs themselves aren't staffed with incredibly thoughtful, smart people. In this regard, Race to the Top opened doors for us in Tennessee. It made us an exciting place to be and allowed us to attract talent that we may not have otherwise. But our commissioner also placed a relentless focus on building a team of leaders that would do exceptional work. He recruited folks from our teacher, principal, and superintendent ranks within the state who had been doing this work for years and were secretly hungry for a change. And he recruited folks from all over the country to come to Tennessee and support the work we were doing. Like myself, became a fabric of that community. Second is management of the work with a critical eye towards what's working and what's not, and having the discernment to know when something can be salvaged and when it can't. When we came to Tennessee, it already had its Race to the Top grant and was just completing the first year of implementation. So for us, the question was, what's working, what's not, how do we decide, and then how do we double down on the things that work and stop doing things that don't work? Which means we had to have a lot of difficult conversations with people to say, you know, we've been doing this for a couple years and we have nothing to show for it. We've got to stop doing this and put our funds into something that's going to get us results, and we did. So good implementation, led by the right people over time, is a game changer. I also learned that good policy and good implementation are about continued refinement, reflection, and improvement over time. There's a real danger in measuring policies against perfection. And so often in my experience, that's what I've seen us do. In July of 2011, Tennessee became one of the first states in the country to implement a comprehensive student outcomes-based statewide teacher evaluation system. Prior to that implementation, the entire year before, we convened a group of teachers, principals, superintendents, legislators, business leaders, you name it, 21 times over the course of that year to dissect issues around the policy and implementation. That group of incredibly talented people came up with a really, really good policy. But was it perfect? No. And the truth is, it was never going to get anywhere near perfect until we did it. In preparation for this speech, I went back to the archives a bit to relive this time, and I found this headline from the Huffington Post that pretty accurately sums up the next few years. It said, quote, "Tennessee teacher evaluation systems have rough road ahead," unquote. So no, it wasn't perfect. And frankly, depending on who you were, it was varying degrees away from perfect. But the question we needed to be asking is not, is it perfect? The question we needed to be asking is it better than what we had before? And then, can we make it better next year? And then can we make it better the year after that? Tackling that question year after year takes thoughtfulness, discipline, and a lot of persistence. Even the smartest of people sitting in a room will never get anywhere near as close to perfect as you will from learning by doing. Over the next few years, we sought a tremendous amount of teacher feedback on the system to figure out what was working and what needed improvement. We went out and spoke with thousands of teachers across the state, answered emails from literally 7,500 teachers talking about their questions and concerns, and administered 2 surveys that garnered more than 30,000 responses from teachers across our state. I can't stress enough how critical that feedback was to our ability to make these policies better and better over time. All too often, I think we view policy through this binary, good, bad, perfect, imperfect system, and we end up getting something we don't want as a result. In Tennessee, we had agreed to adopt the Common Core state standards and join one of the 2 state testing consortiums, PARCC, to assess those standards. We were going to administer the PARCC assessment in the 2014-15 school year. However, as you all saw, a massive wave of pushback to both the standards and the tests took place across the country. And instead of trying to figure out exactly what it was that our stakeholders didn't like about the tests, the legislature scrapped them altogether. The result of that decision was for us to go back to the test we were using previously for 2 more years while we developed a new and better test. Now, I don't want to pretend to speak for the teachers of our state, but I'm pretty sure when they spoke up with criticisms of the PARCC test, it wasn't because they wanted to go back to a test that was not aligned to the standards they were teaching. But when we believe that there are only 2 options, perfect or not at all, this is the danger we find ourselves in. But this isn't all doom and gloom. It is possible to make decisions about policy that are reflective and allow for input on the specific areas that need improvement from the people on the ground. Just a year after doing away with the PARCC assessments, the legislature decided to tackle the Common Core state standards. However, this time, instead of just doing away with them, they called for the formation of a committee of educators to do a thorough analysis of the standards and determine what we wanted to keep, what we wanted to do away with, and what we wanted to tweak and improve. They continued the course with the Common Core standards until this could be done. We're nearing the completion of this process now, and it has been exceptional. Our educators have had an incredibly powerful voice in shaping the standards that they're going to be asked to teach. And we believe we have better standards as a result. So, in closing, I've learned that implementation of the policy is just as important as the policy itself, and focusing on the talent you have in place to do that work is critical. There's no such thing as a perfect policy. Great policy is the result of thoughtful implementation and continued refinement based on feedback from the people doing the work. And finally, educator voice matters, and it's more likely to be heard when it's focused on thoughtful refinement and improvement. In my current role, I oversee the 8 regional field offices for the Tennessee Department of Ed, who are spread out around the state of Tennessee. We have about 65 staff members who are charged with delivering on-the-ground academic support to the school districts in their geographic region. They are the on-the-ground support of the department, helping districts with implementation every day. I continue to do this work because I believe that implementation matters. Continuing to learn from it, make it better year after year, is where we really see the magic happen. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The only time this weekend I will hug a Panthers fan. Thank you so much, Megan. And so I know that you all have questions, I'm sure, and thoughts and comments, so much interesting stuff that came up in that discussion, so please keep track of your questions. You'll have a chance to get them to Megan here at the end. I want to introduce next Chris Ruskowski. And Chris, for those of you who may know already, Chris started his experience as a middle school teacher in the Miami-Dade Corps in 2003. Any Miami folks in the house? Excellent. I think the Delta outrepresents you in Miami. But has a fascinating number of background experiences in systems leadership. After being a classroom teacher, has gone on to do district level work both in Miami-Dade as well as at the Louisiana Recovery School District in San Francisco, and then for the last 5 years has been in the state of Delaware. Has been a part of their very ambitious reform work in Delaware, has served under 3 commissioners there, but throughout it all has been the state's leader on their portfolio of teacher and leader effectiveness work. And so that meant he directly oversees all the efforts on educator preparation, on licensure, on evaluation, recruitment, placement, professional learning, retention, compensation, all of the issues that affect what a state does to help make the lives of teachers more rewarding and higher impact. Please welcome Chris to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. How are we doing? As Mike mentioned, I've been out of the classroom now for about 10 years. So I'm going to ask folks to indulge me a little bit today with some shows of hands throughout the course of the conversation. So first and foremost, most importantly, who stayed up past midnight last night? Keep that hand up past 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Woo! Dare I say 4 a.m.? Okay, all right. I see one. I see. Good, I like that. How about this question? Raise your hand if you believe that teaching is the most important profession in the world. Pretty broad agreement. And then for my folks like Mike that have experience with new leaders and other organizations, how about school leadership as a really important profession, right behind teaching or right in line with teaching? Yeah. So there's broad agreement on this statement, and yet, and I'll talk a little about some of the coalitions that we've built with educators, with principals, with teachers, but yet there's also, and I'm going to focus on this a little bit, there's fractures within those coalitions. There's 99% agreement on this statement about teaching being the most important profession in the world, and yet when we go a level down into what does that mean for a governor or a secretary of education or a legislator in terms of making policy, and then what it means in terms of implementation, there seems to be actually a lot of disagreement on what that should mean. And a lot of that is shaped by our own experiences as teachers, as leaders, and as Corps members. So it turns out this statement means about 101 different things to different people. And if I started to get into the sort of policy details, I think that the number of hands that would go up on questions like, should the best teachers be paid more? Should all teachers be paid more? How many years should a low performer be allowed to be in a classroom with students? How hard should it be to become a principal in the first place? That's when a lot of the disagreement starts. And that's when policy making, as you've heard Megan and Mike refer to, becomes very, very difficult when you start to walk down the road into some of those questions. And if you're a policymaker already, if you're a policymaker in the room, you know that ultimately making that decision about where to draw the line on these various cases becomes very difficult. I will say that a decade ago, when I was finishing up my core experience, I had hoped that there would be more consensus on this statement. And I had hoped that educators and principals and other folks were deeply involved in the policy-making process. I taught in Miami-Dade County, 2003 Charter Corps member. Where's my Miami people one more time? Where are they? There's like 5 of you here. I had hoped as I moved into places like Baton Rouge and now today Dover that there was broader consensus on these issues. And I had hoped that there was more people coming to Dover. The first time I walked into Legislative Hall in Dover, I assumed there would be a couple of educator groups over here, a parent group over here, a principal group over here, leaders of color, teachers of color, young teachers, old teachers. I thought, just walk into the assembly and all these people be having these robust discussions. But raise your hand if you're part of an organization that tries to put pressure on the policy environment. Pretty good in this room. Let me talk about a few examples from 12 years ago and see if this resonates with many of you that I believe are probably still core members, still teaching, or still working in schools. So in my 2 years at John F. Kennedy Middle School in Miami-Dade, I was observed 3 times. Once, the Rookie of the Year Teacher Committee came through for about 20 minutes with about 10 people, a lot of fanfare, a lot of distraction, to look at me and the 16 other teachers that were brand new in the building. The second time, Assistant Principal McCard came through because Janet Reno was coming the following week for Teach for America Week, and he wanted to make sure that the classroom was in full compliance with fire code. There was a big hole in the middle of my portable classroom, and there was like a hole in the floor. And that baby was fixed the day before Janet Reno got there. The third time was the standard, 30-minute observation to assess my effectiveness. And in meeting with my assistant principal at the end of my first year of teaching, I was informed that this is one of the best lessons he had ever seen. Great job. Keep up the good work. At the end of my first year of teaching. I will say, and this is why I'm so proud to be a part of Teach for America, I was observed multiple times by my PDs, now MTLDs, that came in multiple times throughout the year, sat there for an hour, reflected with me for an hour after those observations, people like Jane Henserling and others that were part of that Miami-Dade region 10 years ago, and that's really how I grew as an educator in those early years. And my APs and principals were well-intentioned. I don't think that they were, there was 2,000 students in the building. 90% were recent immigrants from Haiti. There was a lot going on. There was multiple things happening in that building. But it was hard for me not to come to the following takeaways. And let me also note that in that 30-minute observation, that was one of the best lessons that he had ever seen, there was really no conversation about student learning. The amount of student learning, measurable student learning. Had my kids learned anything? And so it was hard for me not to come to the following sort of conclusions based on my experience. And again, everyone's experience is different as a teacher. This is why it starts to get difficult when you start to work your way into policy. But it's hard for me to not think, man, there should be some type of assessment for 7th and 8th grade social studies that is used commonly throughout Miami-Dade County Public Schools or throughout the state of Florida, where we can look at student learning. There should be, right? I hope there's not only one person that agrees with that. 2, all right, 2. Second, there should be some type of rubric, some type of instrument that is used to assess teacher effectiveness. Now again, this is 2004. Third, principals and assistant principals should be trained in their principal preparation programs on how to do observation and feedback. Again, I had sort of assumed that was part of the normal principal preparation program. And a world there shouldn't be a world in which it takes a political dignitary to come to your classroom to get the pothole fixed in the middle of the portable, right? Now, there's an intersection here between politics and policy that we're all touching on in our own way, and certainly Mike experiences this, I'm sure, every day, but there's an intersection here. You know, if I ask the question, raise your hand if you've seen politics play a role in your school or in your organization. Raise your hand, everybody. Keep your hand up if that politics has led to change for good. How about raise your hand if that politics has led to change for bad? Right? So we're about 3-1 on politics leading to, or politics being some sort of pejorative phrase, leading to bad things, leading to negative consequences, leading to not the changes that we want to see. And I think this idea of more educators being at the table, more school leaders being at the table, is because we're trying to influence the political equation, which is a very, very difficult one to influence. As I neared the end of my 2-year teaching commitment, which at the time, and this is, I think, it was a lot different than where Teach for America is today. The 2-year commitment was sort of very firm and in stone, and I'm very proud of the way that Teach for America has evolved on that over the last decade. But I went in at the end of my 2-year commitment, and I loved my principal, Principal Mikulus. She was from Georgia. Yeah. She's like, come on in, Christopher, come on in. And she said, I said to her, I would really like to stay here at John F. Kennedy Middle School. I'd love to stay, love to be a part of this team, this faculty. But I got to be honest, I also want to grow. And so can you talk to me about some of the ways, compensation, additional responsibility, teacher leadership opportunities, being a part of the cabinet, something that would show me that, you know, that every year of teaching would be a little bit different for me, that I would sort of evolve in my leadership and evolve in the amount of responsibility. Could I be a PLC lead, a department chair? And first of all, I don't know if many teachers had asked her that question in her career, and I don't know if she was prepared to answer that question. And certainly the district had not prepared her to answer that question. There was a steps and lanes pay schedule. Department chairs were based mostly on seniority. And pay bumps, whether for performance or for extracurricular activities or for coaching basketball, were minimal, if not at all. And so it's hard not to walk away from that conversation as I then headed into this career in policy, thinking that there needed to be compensation reform for educators, thinking that there needed to be more teacher leadership opportunities for educators, thinking that, especially with this next generation of educators, that people are going to want to know what it's not necessarily a selfish thing, it's in every other career, it's in every other profession, what's in it for me? Is that a terrible question to ask just because we're teachers? I don't think so. And yet, so many of the policy and political pressures continuously force us to think about this in terms of treating all teachers the same, treating all principals the same, and basing many of these things on seniority and other things. Now, in Delaware over the last 5 years, we've made a lot of progress. But again, if I started to ask people, are these things progress, there would be fractures in the room, there'd be fractures on these policy issues. Today, every educator in Delaware is held, because when I got there 6 years ago, it was not that different than where Miami was 12 years ago. But today, every educator is held accountable to student learning. Raise your hand if student learning should be 100% of a teacher's evaluation. How about 90, 80? 70, 60, 50. How about only 10%? How about 0%? Right? When you start to get into these policy questions, the amount of variation, even amongst folks that I assume the majority of people here are alumni of Teach for America or core members, there's a lot of fracture on those things. So today's social studies teachers have student learning as part of their assessments. Every teacher in Delaware has student learning as part of their assessments. Today there is 90 minutes of collaborative planning time for all teachers in Delaware. Today there are teacher leadership opportunities like the Delaware Dream Team and the Delaware Talent Cooperative, where teachers do make more money if they're getting better student achievement results, and if they're staying in our highest need schools. But when I asked 49 schools if they wanted to participate in that initiative, only 10 said yes. So again, the fractures on these issues, even if we agree to the sort of original statement, teaching is the most important profession in the world, are deep. I'll ask folks that are interested in policy, that are core members, that are sort of working their way up through the policy ranks, to ask yourself some of these, questions. And I'll sort of close with 4 questions here. Because I think there are costs and unintended consequences to some of the policy agenda that race to the top states like Tennessee and Delaware and others have moved forward on over the past 5 years. Do educator evaluation policies result in less autonomy for educators? And if so, is that a bad thing? Does the focus on measurable student learning stifle innovation? Do new principal preparation policies like the ones in Delaware, which allow for nonprofits and third-party organizations, Teach for America has started Lead for Delaware in the Delaware context to train and prepare principals outside of the higher education system. And we've opened up that door for those types of principal prep programs. Do those types of programs hurt our relationships with higher education at a time when we need those partnerships more than ever? And lastly, does the focus on teacher compensation, which is a major focus in Delaware right now, diminish some of the esteem or some of the reasons that we go into teaching, which are never really about compensation? As you wrestle with those questions, please know those questions are asked of me every single day in Delaware. And as a policymaker, it's about trying to find the nuance between these ideals. Teaching is the most important profession in the world, which we all agreed to, and actually trying to make decisions about how to effectuate those policies for teachers and for children. So thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. And raises the great challenge that the difficulty of policy is taking those ideas that we all may agree on at 40,000 feet of altitude and driving those down to 30,000 and 20,000 and 1,000 and then 1 foot of specificity. And at that level, the details get very difficult. It is really an honor for me to share the stage this morning with Chairman Miller, who I mentioned is one of my personal heroes. I will say, for those of you that don't know his background, if you look at his almost 40 years of service in the House of Representatives, and you look at any of the most compelling or comprehensive pieces of legislation that have been passed in that time, you will find George Miller's hands are on them. Whether it is anything from early education legislation to No Child Left Behind, to the Affordable Care Act, to higher ed affordability, to Pell Grants, there is literally nothing probably that your kids have access to at the federal level that George Miller didn't help craft. And I'll say something more than that, which is I think maybe the most compelling thing about Chairman Miller is there is, when you get to work in politics, there are nonpartisan staff who see all of the comings and goings of what committee members do and committee chairs do, and they are kind of the unbiased assessment of whether or not you can get things done or not. And the House historian who takes a look at all of the committees that have operated said in the last 50 years of his time, he has never seen a committee more productive, more collaborative, or more successful than the House Education Committee under George Miller's leadership, which I think is an amazing testament. So I just want to say, in a moment where there is a great deal of debate about whether or not it is possible for one person to fundamentally change the tenor of the debate in Washington, or whether it's possible for one person to build a coalition that can fundamentally change policy in a dramatic way in Washington, I think there's no better example of a George Miller than the fact that that is true. There's a great Emerson quote, which is, an institution is the lengthened shadow of a man. There are a number of venerable institutions in this city, probably none that are better examples of the lengthened shadow of a man than the one that George Miller has cast on American education policy. Please welcome Chairman George Miller to the stage.
Excuse me, I'm hobbling around a little bit here wearing a boot here for attendance, so in my age, you shouldn't carry extra things you're not used to. But thank you so much. Michael, you're one of my heroes. Michael, in so many ways, has accomplished at the legislative level, which is sort of the most difficult area to get accomplishments in education. So many of the policies that so many states continue to fight over, districts fight over, and it's almost as they relish the fight more than the questions of what will the outcome be. So congratulations on what you've done, and he's done it. When we get into these huge fights on teacher evaluation, I remember that at his signing ceremony for the teacher evaluation that Randy Weingarten was standing right alongside of Michael. So that tells you how good he is at bringing people together. And it's exciting to see. And to Megan and Chris, it's just fantastic. When Common Core came on, because it wasn't our doing, it was the state's. It was so exciting to see that kind of reevaluation, and then to see, you can only strike out at Obamacare so many times, and then you got to re-energize your forces. And this was a political trick to re-energize the far right, to talk about the federal government, Common Core taking over schools, when in fact it came the other way. It came from the governors. It came from philanthropic organizations thinking about the future of America. But thank you for hanging in there. And so many states have done, even where it's been under serious attack, they've in fact turned around and really had to relabel it, change it, but the goals and the purposes are the same. So it tells you how weak that political argument was, but it was simply to raise money from the far right. Chris, man, you're in the trenches. It's fantastic, because this is what it should be. It should be this kind of consideration of policy and change at the state level. And it's so incredibly important. When I went to Congress, before you were all born, that's not funny. You'll have to know that I majored in American humor when I was in college, so it was a prep school course for Congress, and it's worked out really well. Builds your tolerance if you can see the humor in all of it. That's not funny either, but it's true. I've had more damn fun in my life. The first thing that came across our desk when I became a member of the Education and Labor Committee was the question of children out of school. It wasn't raised by school districts. It wasn't raised by superintendents or governors. It was raised by the Children's Defense Fund, our most notable graduate, Hillary Clinton. But it was raised by the Children's Defense Fund to say, why aren't these children in school? Well, what we saw was that they weren't in school because they were minorities, they were poor, they suffered from a disability, and there was really no absolute federal right, other than the constitutional right, to go to school. And so where were they? They were in church basements, they were in private homes, they were in their own home, left alone. And it was a stunning report. It was a stunning report. And many of them were suspended, so they could justify that they weren't in school. The district would suspend them. The suspension policy even today is skewered in the wrong way. And then the next thing that came across our desk was what was in those days called Education to All Handicapped Children, now called IDEA. And the idea that if you had a disability, that if you needed a walker or you needed an assistant or you had to rely on crutches or a wheelchair, these were the physical manifestations of some disabilities. Obviously, a rather primitive time at that time in education, not dealing with people's mental disabilities and handicaps, that you had no right to be in school. And so that was the first thing I was involved in. I was told that these children didn't belong in school. They were going to be disrupted. They couldn't learn. They had no right. It was a burden on the district. Well, 40 years later, Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa, we were sort of the last remaining people in Congress that had written that law today. We celebrated that out in Berkeley at the Independent Living Center. And I looked across the audience, and as we were getting our award, I was talking to Senator Harkin, and I said, look at this. This is the exact population that they said couldn't thrive. And we were looking out at teachers, we were looking out at doctors, we were looking out at lawyers, we were looking out at counselors, we were looking out at community workers, at elected officials, and they had all kinds of disabilities, and they had all kinds of achievement. So who said they didn't belong in school? And for me, the question of politics and involvement in public policy is really about that. It's about the touchstones of opportunity and the access of the means to be able to exploit that opportunity on your behalf, or your behalf on behalf of society as you see it. And those are still the key questions today, because the question is in the education system, is this in fact an opportunity? And is this an opportunity that's going to be meaningful? And is this an opportunity that's going to empower you to take hold of your life, to participate in the American economic system, the American society, as you see fit? And the answer, sadly, is for many, many young children starting their education, the answer is no. This is not going to be a meaningful opportunity. This is not going to prepare you to navigate the American society and its economic system. But that's not a secret. But it continues. And what changes that is the idea that you can participate. And that given your expertise, your experiences, your education, your talents, it demands that you participate. Very often, various organizations suggest that this is too important, too complex for the people to participate in it. Whether that's economic policy, whether that's the mystery of junk bonds, or whether that's the mystery of how a child learns to read at grade level. Just leave it to us. It's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. All of the arguments against citizen participation in all of our institutions are self-serving. Because when the people do show up, be they Tea Party or be they Occupy Wall Street, they generally are successful. And they can overwhelm financially the most powerful interest in the country. They can overwhelm the oil industry. They can overwhelm an entrenched school bureaucracy. That's why in California it finally took the trigger law. We said you only get to ignore parents for so long before we get to decide whether or not we're going to change this school, and we're going to go to the people and we're going to make a decision. They said, oh, these are all outliers. Well, it's now the state law. It's not an outlier policy. And that's because people who are concerned about education, starting with those parents who are constantly ignored by the local educational authorities, ignored in their cries for justice for their kids and for the ability of their children to learn at grade level and their children to be able to exploit the opportunity of this education for their well-being. So too often people tell you can't, this is too complex, it's too... That's an argument. They don't want you to look behind the curtain. You know, people ask me about lobbying in Congress, and I always say the most effective lobby that I've encountered, and it's a little different now because the situation has changed, but in the old days, my days, When you went to school lunch, it was prepared by a lot of people because it was prepared on site. Now it's prepackaged foods, and the big food industry's into it, and it's sort of just dumped there, and you pick up your cart and your juice box and this, that thing, and you go on about your business. But when we had the child nutrition fights up, and we first started putting in federal money and state money, the school food service people, I think that was their name at that time. Now they're nutritionists or something, but in those days they were mothers and fathers who were working in the cafeteria. They would insist that you as a member of Congress come and see their school lunch program, and that you understood and you participated in it. And I would see members after members that come to me and say, I got to go to the school district, I got to visit this lunch program, I'm not interested in this stuff, I don't even know, the family should be doing this, why are we doing this in schools, yada, 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 yada. Okay, go to the school. When they went to the school and they put their big fat ass in a little tiny fourth grade chair, and they got that little carton of milk and they couldn't get the straw and they got all screwed up, and the kids had to help them, And then when they tried to sneak over, they said, no plate waste, They'd come back, to Congress and they'd say, hey, how did that visit go at your school? And they'd say, my school lunch program is really good. I said, we won that one. Now let's get to the next member of Congress and have them have a site visit here. Tyler Hester, where is Tyler? Is he here? He's boycotted this meeting because I'm here. Okay. He's taken me by the hand, and his predecessors before him, as a representative of Teach for America, as a teacher, and now running the school in a very difficult school district in my old congressional district. And he's constantly brought me to the classes, and we did it as recently as a week ago. And you can walk out of there and say, my fourth grade class, I watched these kids criticize, discuss, help one another in a discussion of civil rights that I probably wouldn't see in most high schools. And the Teach for America teacher had just an incredible organization and involvement by these students. And that's why this question of how do you get involved, politics screams for involvement. It's not you don't have to have a credential. You have to have your citizenship. You have to have your interest. You have to have your concern for your community, however you deem it. But it is about being a citizen. I don't mean in the legal sense, because we'd never have a trigger law if we just had to rely on the legal people to do it. They had to do, kids were being discriminated for a whole lot of other reasons. But it's about being a citizen, this involvement in our school systems. This nation cannot suffer the number of children who can't read at grade level, at third grade or ninth grade. Okay? They cannot suffer the number of children who can't achieve a high school diploma. And very often we now see, as we go back and we're starting to work on efforts to get them those diplomas, they were almost chased out of school. Okay? So let's understand what's taking place here. But this is the fundamental organizational principle in our society, is that it's education that's going to give you the keys to the kingdom. Whether you use them or not is one thing, but if you can't get it, it's another thing. And so to be a citizen demands this involvement. When I was young we started what we called new math. And that was really a way that you could get the parents out of the school and stop helping their children because they were confusing their children. So they said, we really don't need your help. You don't understand this. This is new math. Oh, really? So what is 2 and 2 today? I don't know. Yesterday it was 4, but what is it today? And unfortunately, a lot of the parents never came back to school with that kind of involvement. But community involvement, and one of the things that Teach for America drives is that kind of community involvement, asking people to come in and participate in the classroom or in the school board meeting. This is fundamental. And I can't tell you enough. When I look out here and I see all this talent, and I see the number of you raise your hands that have been involved, this is the key to change. It will never change from within. There's too many vested interests. They got it about the way they want it, folks, but that's not necessarily very good for the students. That's not necessarily very good for the future. And yet we also know, because you've all created people who've been in that system and feel locked in and now step forward because you're on their school site. You're talking about it in a different way, and they gravitate to it because you know what? They want to be the best teacher too. But very often, and I say this at 40 years experience, very often politics will keep them from becoming the best teacher because we just don't do it that way on this campus. We don't do it that way in this district. Well, that's really good for the adults. It's sure as hell not very good for the students. And what Teach for America and similar organizations and advocacy organizations have asked, is this good for the children? And once you start asking those questions, when you get in a hell of a lot of trouble, but you get a very different answer. But you also then get an answer that when broadcast, changes the politics. So you still, even though you're 25 years old, you're still the insurgents. And you're the insurgents that we can't afford to lose. Locally, we're trying to elect them to the school boards, and we're succeeding. We're having a hell of a lot of fun. But it just can't be. I've got schools where, small schools, that I don't even know if they should probably be closed and merged or something. But you got 15 teachers. When I was sort of, 20 years ago, we had 14 new teachers every year in that school because you could bid out, right? And where'd you bid out? You went to the hills. You got off the flatlands in my district. And the poor were left behind. And the teacher that stayed, she was hiding. She was hiding. They couldn't budge her, and she didn't have to do anything except create chaos. Because she ran the school, not the principal who was there this year, and not the new principal who was there next year, and not that principal who left in the middle of the year, and now we had a new principal. No. You had one teacher who controlled the whole school, and everybody else fled. Is it a surprise that I will tell you that's the worst performing school in the state of California for year after year after year? We think things are going to change today because we've got a Teach for America principle. We're really excited about that. And so are the parents, and so are the kids, and so is the faculty. They're not thinking so quickly about bidding out of that school. They now see a mission. They see a purpose. They see a reason. And so, where's that clock? I passed it. Oh, we're back to 30 minutes. Okay. I would just say that I hope this becomes the center of conversation. Citizen participation is really, really the disinfectant of politics. And I love politics. I had the greatest time of my life. I was able to do more for more people than anything I could have ever imagined as a young person. It just is exciting to me, just absolutely exciting. But my career was successful because whether it was in the environmental areas, whether it was in the healthcare areas, whether it's in education, we benefited from the involvement of people like you. And in education, I tell you, my span of time, you're changing the world, you're changing this country, and you're changing these schools. And we're the better for it. And I think more and more people are starting to understand that. And in tough neighborhoods, politically tough neighborhoods, in tough districts, and in tough states where teachers show up. The rewrite of No Child Left Behind, which I created with Senator Kennedy and Speaker Boehner, and we were told by the people who were the best people in advertising a few years ago that we created the most unpopular brand in the history of America. But you got to be proud for what you're proud for. But I would just close with this. The rewrite of that legislation, which I think they actually did a pretty damn good job, given political times and everything else, and maybe overreach by the federal government and how much we can screw around in a district with effectiveness and not just trouble. I think they did a basically good job. But that good job was a result of a lot of Teach for America energy and other organizations similarly, whether it's New Schools or Teach Plus, those personal visits to those Senate offices and to those congressional offices. You know what's still standing in that law? That it's a civil rights law, that it's going to be basic to the civil rights of these children, whether or not they get that education. And those districts are going to have to perform on their behalf. Maybe we didn't get evaluation the way it should. I'm not sure you can do that from Washington. You'll have to do that as you did inside Tennessee or inside of Delaware. But the fact of the matter is, still requires 95% of those children to take that exam. And they did that because people visited those Senate offices day after day after day after day. It's into the thousands of people that visited. as teachers, saying, let me tell you what this means. Everybody says, how can you make 95% of the kids take the test? Well, when we started writing the law, on test day, notices went out and said, if you need a doctor's appointment, keep your child out of school. We're going to have a field trip to the zoo. We're going to have a field trip to the wetlands. We're going to have a field trip to the automobile factory, all on test day. Interestingly enough, who's going? Those who will drag down our school average. I think that's a violation of your civil rights. I just kind of suspect that that's just not the equal education that the Constitution and the state constitutions of this country talk about. That's why those things are there. Now we'll see how they do with that. But I'm just telling you, this was a rewrite of the basic fundamental education law of this country from Brown v. Board of Education that was about to go over the cliff until you all got involved, whether you did it individually or as an organization, and explained to members of Congress what is possible with these young people and what the barriers are and what the benchmarks have to be to ensure their civil rights. I can't thank you all enough. Thank you so very much, because you ensured another decade of civil rights for these kids. Thank you so very much.
That's what passion and real honesty sounds like when it's also merged with integrity. A great balance. Okay, we are delighted to reserve a bunch of time for questions for any of the panelists. We have 2 microphones right here. If you wouldn't mind just jumping into line if you have questions you'd like to ask for any one of us up here, we'd be delighted to take them. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Carrie Finnegan. I'm a Connecticut 2009 Corps member, and my question is for Megan. So first of all, I just wanted to say how impressed and inspired I am by the work that you've done with so many others in Tennessee. It really is a great example for states across the country, so thank you. With that said, when Common Core came around when I first began teaching, I was really excited because in Connecticut we had what I considered very low standards that were not holding students across the state to a high bar. And so the 2 promises of Common Core that really excited me was 1, higher, more rigorous expectations for children, and 2, it was going to be adopted by states across the country so we could hold each other accountable to these high standards and really compare how students in Connecticut were doing to how students in California were doing. So my question is, do you feel like what Tennessee has gained in increasing stakeholder buy-in and allowing teachers to really feel like they can shape the standards that they're teaching in the classroom, is that gain worth the loss potentially of kind of having these norm standards across the country and having states hold each other accountable in that way?
Yeah. Is this on now? Hello? Yeah. That's a fantastic question. Thank you for your comments as well about the work. While we went through that standards review process, we were very intentional on holding rigor at the level that the expectations had set through the Common Core state standards. And so, you know, I think you're right that we lose the exact one-to-one, apples-to-apples comparison. But I think we've kept a really intentional focus on making sure that our standards are at the same level of rigor. I'll tell you that if I had to guess, I would say maybe 10%, 10 to 20% of the standards have changed. The rest of the standards remain, you know, exactly as they were in Common Core. So I think we keep the level of rigor, which will allow us some level of comparability to compare ourselves to other states, but certainly you're right, you know, not that exact match that we would have wanted. But these are, you know, sort of the consequences of the hard decisions that you have to make, so.
Chairman, do you want to weigh in on that? How important is it in your mind, the issue of comparability for data across states?
Well, I think, you know, you'd love to have comparability because I think you would help outlier states that just aren't performing as well as they should on behalf of the students. But Tennessee has, you know, really has a very important interest here. They're attracting a huge amount of manufacturing. And they know that they're going to have to prepare if they're going to have Tennesseans working in that manufacturing. So it's a driver, and Senator Alexander, I think, recognized that, because there were people that wanted him just to destroy all of that, and he wouldn't do it. And I think the governor of Tennessee and Senator Alexander both understand if they're going to get the new BMW plant, if they're going to get the next generation of manufacturing, that school district is going to have to perform. That's a message to other governors. That's the reason Common Core was started, because a lot of governors said nobody's going to work in our state, because there's essentially very little education system in place. And so I think it's an important lesson, and it's not to be condemned like you've lost everything because that uniformity. I think it was Megan point. We would hope that a lot of states would get to Tennessee still. So it's an important benchmark.
Yes, come over to this side.
Yes, Senator Johnson, I loved your quote about an institution being the length and shadow of a man from Emerson, and I want to build on that with a question. How do we determine what the length and the shadow is? I think that the man is forever changing and growing in different ways, and so when we determine success, I think we need to evaluate what that definition actually is. So is success always going to be determined by statistics and tests? If I have a student class that is reading at the 6th grade level and I'm teaching a 10th grade class, I'm moving at a different rate than somebody who maybe has a 9th grade level and is trying to get to the 10th grade. So can we maybe do other things like incorporate the arts, which used to be mandatory in educational systems? If you look at Hardiman's brain-targeted teaching, she talks a lot about the way the brain works, the environment, and different things that you can do other than just reading and writing that should also determine success. Is there a way to build that into policy?
Great question. I'm happy to take a crack if other folks want to. So I would say a couple of things to your question I'm so excited about. One is that I was the principal of an art school, and so we required as much art every day as we did science and mathematics. It was a core part of every curriculum. It was a way students accessed information, a way they expressed what they learned. So I think that absolutely what you want is a well-rounded exposure to those things, because kids find passion in different areas, and what you want are the things that get them to want to get out of bed in the morning and come to school. And for a lot of our kids, it was visual art for a long time before it was ever mathematics. So I absolutely think that the goal there is to grab people's passion. And we felt when we talked about what is the right balance for the percentage of teacher evaluation that's based on student growth. Our belief when I was a school principal in our school was, we have two fundamental obligations as educators. One is to help prepare young people to be great citizens of the world, to be the kind of people you want to work next to or live next to or be married to or be stuck on a subway with. Like, that is a huge and vital part of what educators do. And we thought that was as important a 50% as the fact that we also wanted to make sure when they got out into the world, they had the reading and math and critical thinking skills they needed to pursue their own dreams. So that balance for us was very deliberate, to say there are all of these deeply important intangible elements of making for great educators and making for great kids that we also want to focus on, not to the exclusion of only language arts and math. And so that's why we pushed on what you want is a well-rounded dashboard that looks at not just things like language arts and math scores, but also looks at what are you doing, what kind of impact are you having on the community, on the kids in your classroom, what sort of extracurriculars are you involved in, what leadership are you showing, how many kids when they are in moments of crisis show up at your door in tears asking for you to help them find a way forward, because that's a huge part of what we do. So I absolutely agree with you, and I think that's why we have a lot of states right now looking at broader dashboards for student and school success than just academic performance. We're doing that in Colorado. I think there are a lot of states that are, and I think we're excited about it. Thank you so much for the question. Anyone else want to add to that? Great. Yes, ma'am, over here.
Yeah, so I'd say my question just builds right off of that question. I'm an elected member of the Cincinnati Public School Board, and when I was listening to everybody speak, we talk a lot about measuring what matters, and what I heard from everybody was academics matters. And if all we're saying matters is learning growth and measuring kids' learning growth, then what we have seen, and I think what we see in the classrooms too, is that that's all that's funded. So that's all that's funded, that's all that's supported, and that's all that's graded. So in my city, we have the second highest child poverty rates in the country. And so what we believe matters is caring for the whole child. And so we have this state report card that says we are a failing district. And so we have expanded that definition within our own city to measure things like how many kids have access to free and reduced lunch. We've expanded it to have health clinics at over a dozen of our schools. Every child has access to mental health services and the arts, and we've expanded AP access beyond our magnet schools to every high school. So those are things we believe matters, but they are not funded from the federal or the state level, nor are they graded. And so I'm wondering, I think similar to the previous conversation of how do we move the conversation at the federal and our state levels to say, yes, we all agree that academics matters and that is our core responsibility, but we need to be measuring a lot of other stuff because we then fund what we measure and we measure what matters.
Great question. Chairman, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, just speaking from the federal level, in terms of the Title I funding, which would be the big component, and certainly to those schools with the most difficult and challenged populations for a whole host of reasons, that money can be used in those schools to teach art. It just says it must be used in the education of those children. I think one of the things that may be better about this rewrite than when we did No Child Left Behind, that it makes it a little clearer that determination's a local determination. We're not going to try to decide curriculum from Washington, D.C. I think that's an important message. But understand this, nowhere has it ever been suggested that you don't teach. I don't know what happened to school districts, and remember No Child Left Behind. It's against the federal, it was against the law for the federal government to develop tests for states. We can't require those tests. All we said was, whatever test you give, we want to know the results for all of the children, and we want you to disaggregate the data. We want to know how many English learners there are, students with disabilities, children of color, incomes, okay? Whatever test. I don't know what all of a sudden that became 14 or 15 tests a year at the local level. I think in New York City it was almost 19 tests or something. It went crazy. I don't know when the education establishment decided that drill and kill was superior to teaching. And the idea that you would exclude the arts, you know, we had the worst performing school in Oregon about 15 years ago. So they said, we're going to become a math academy, and everybody laughed. And they said, how are you going to do this? We're going to give them a piece of wood and a ruler, and we're going to go tell them to cut 6 3/4 inches off of the end of that board, and we're going to give them, everybody has to choose to play an instrument. 2 years later, they were the #1 school in the state, won awards from Hewlett-Packard, from Intel. So there's a lot of ways to do this, but to blame it all on No Child Left Behind and say, oh, they demanded we do this. All we wanted was the results of any test, and the tests at that time were different in Texas than they were in Wisconsin and different in Florida. That we just want to know, is everybody taking this test, and can you tell us how these populations are doing? And of course, the effort became to try to stop that.
Did you want to jump in,
Yeah,
Chris?
just a brief word, because I think we're at a point now, where whether on the Cincinnati School Board or working at the Delaware Department of Education, where there is broad agreement that a comprehensive agenda is what's needed, right? That there's a lot of sort of false dichotomies being put out there. You know, what matters? Is it arts or is it reading? Both. Support or accountability? Both. Diversity or talent? Both, right? So it's like there's all these false dichotomies, and yet, so we need a comprehensive approach to all of these things that were articulated in the last two questions. But just a word on attracting the kind of talent into government, into state agencies, into districts, into places like Cincinnati, to actually have a team of people to deliver on all of those things at all levels of the system. I think that's where we're falling short. But I think there's broad agreement on that the agenda should be fairly comprehensive.
Megan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I also just wanted to add, like, the truth is, like, at the state level, we're an incredibly blunt instrument. You know, we don't have the ability to get to the level of nuance around what's really happening in schools and classrooms that you're describing. So the reality we live in is that, you know, when 70%, 65, 70% of our third graders in our state can't read, like, that is our job to fix, and that's where our focus is. And we are a blunt instrument, and we have to do that through accountability and a focus on results. And so I just wanted to add that thought.
Yeah.
Just add,
Thank
yeah,
you so
like,
much. We have
70%
about
of
5
kids
minutes
couldn't
left, so I'm
have
going to try to
access
get through as
healthcare.
many
You would
questions
measure
as I
that.
can here. If you want to, maybe the next two folks both give us your questions, and then so go ahead if both you, and then if there's some similarities, we'll let the panel respond to them both. We'll try to get two more from this side, and then unfortunately we'll have to wrap, but we will be able to be around to ask some questions afterwards. So we'll try to, if you want to give us your two quick questions, we'll try to get as much feedback for you as we can.
I have a question about teacher evaluation and when policy is written. Is there an assumption made that the students are motivated to demonstrate their mastery? Because that's not my experience being in the classroom 20 years after my commitment.
Thank you so much. Do you want to jump in also?
Yeah. First, I just want to say thank you all so much, especially Chairman Miller, for all the work you've done for everybody in this room. Truly and genuinely thank you. Also, Megan, I'm a Memphis Corps member, and I got to thank you for all that you've done for what we're doing down there, so thank you so much. My question was actually to Chris specifically, and if anybody else wants to jump in, I'd love that as well. But Chris, you mentioned relationships between your state and higher ed departments that are a pipeline for your educators and your leaders. And I was wondering how, I'm sure many people in this room have different experiences with their administration, some great, some not so great. How do we, as people who are interested in influencing policy, hold our pipelines accountable to creating great teachers and creating great administrators, whether it's Teach for America or whether it's Delaware University or whatever it is?
Chris, you want to give us your quick thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Maybe
quick,
respond to the idea of student involvement and outcomes of the assessments if you want to as well.
Really quick thoughts. So Delaware in October released our first ever teacher preparation report cards. And we looked at all programs, alternative, traditional, right? We broke it down at the program level, so even though we only have about 5 major institutions of higher ed, there were about 50 programs that we looked at. And we looked at a series of domains ranging from educators' perceptions of those programs a year or two after they left them. Hey, did that program prepare me well? And student performance and diversity and placement in high need schools, right? Is there a track within your program that actually prepares people to teach in rural and urban schools? So I'd encourage you to go and check that out and have a look at those report cards that we released in October, and happy to connect and share those with you. On the other question, I think we've made the assumption in the educator evaluation world, and certainly there's a broader conversation about student consequences that's embedded in the previous question. But we're sort of embedding in there that building both extrinsic and intrinsic motivation in our students is part of the school's job, right? Is part of the school's function. And so we're asking school leaders and teachers to build that in students that don't come with it to start, and to sort of fuel it if it's already there.
Great point. And one of the key improvements for us in the new assessment was the ability to actually have assessment information back in time for report cards is our goal in Colorado, so that assessment data could be part of a student's accountability at the end of the year, not just educators. So I think that's an important change as well. You all get the last two, and then I'll do a quick closing comment. So if you can give us your last 2 quick questions, we'll try to address them as
Yes,
best we can.
hi. My name's Adia Hogue. I'm a 4th generation public school educator. And I have seen and had been having these conversations my entire life. I'm also a proud 4th generation union member as well. So my question really is going to revolve around class size, because that's the only thing that hasn't been talked about yet. And as an educator myself, I'm now out of the classroom, but the only thing that seems to have constantly changed since my great-grandmother started teaching in my home state of California is the class size keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now that I'm in and out of schools all day, that's my job, I walked into a kindergarten class in Baltimore that had 36 kids in it. And in the state of Maryland, you don't have to have a teacher's assistant except for special ed and pre-K. That means that teacher's in there by themselves. And in Maryland, class size is a non-negotiable. In Massachusetts, where I did my 6 years of education, of higher ed, it's negotiable. In California, as I'm sure Representative Miller knows, it's negotiable.
Great. Can I ask you to
However,
wrap up just so we can get to the second
so
question?
my question is, why aren't we talking about class size when we know out of best practices, class size matters?
Great, thank you. And if we can get to our second one, we'll try to get your, as many thoughts as we can to both of these two questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's hard to follow that, but my name's Nicole, Colorado Corps member. Woohoo! My question is related to general advice for future policymakers. I'm a graduate student of education and public policy right now at Stanford, and Brian Stevenson was just there speaking about race relations in the U.S. and the importance for policymakers to get proximate to the problem. I think that's really relevant for educators, that you want to make a big systemic change, but also recognizing the context of individual schools. So my question is around how do you stay proximate to the problems in education?
Great. So maybe, Chairman, we'll give you the closing thoughts if you have them on either class size and how you stay close to the problem, and I'll offer some closing thoughts around that as well.
On class size really probably is determined more by the economics of the state at any given time. In California, when we were flush with money, we lowered class size dramatically. When the recession hit, it went right back up. The question is, it's the only thing that matters? Not so. There's an awful lot of scientific data suggesting that class size matters in certain circumstances, but not in all circumstances. And that's not an argument. I mean, I'm not trying to get an argument, but I'm just saying there's a lot of data out there suggesting you may want to target that class size to the first couple of grades, what have you, if you're limited in resources. But it's much more a function of state budgets than it is any conscious educational decision. I'm a big supporter of class size reduction. I live with school teachers, so that's the way it is. And what was the other?
About proximity to the problem. How do you stay close to the work as a policymaker?
For 40 years, I flew back to my district every week from Washington. I just wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to be involved. I pull my car over. I see an interesting new business. I go and knock on the door and say, "What are you doing here? What do you make? What do you do?" And I do the same thing with schools until schools say, "Would you get out of my class? Just get out of my class," because I just love to see it work where it's working. And to try to absorb that as a policymaker when we hear generalizations, so you hear all schools this or all teachers that, I can be very tough on teachers. I have a 100% labor union record. I was chairman of the labor committee. Okay, I've received all of the awards, but that doesn't mean you're right all of the time. Okay, and so I think you have to continue to have this debate. And I think it's important. It's important for the kids, and it's important that, that's why I was trying to say, invite everybody into that debate. It makes it a lengthy debate, but it's important because too often that debate is trying to exclude people from those decisions. I'm a much more small d democratic person. I believe we've been given a gift in this country of citizen participation, and that muscle is going to atrophy if it's not used, especially when you bring your skills and your memories and your talents and your experiences to that debate. That debate changes rather rapidly. You can usually see it in the first 8 or 9 minutes.
Thank you so much. I have one closing thought, and then we'll thank the committee and get you all off to your next session. I was at the Congress yesterday with my son, my 8-year-old son, who came with me this weekend, and we were visiting, and there's a hall of sculptures there, and one of the sculptures is of Helen Keller. And I just know this story because I've been reading it to my 4-year-old daughter, but if you don't know the story of Helen Keller, it's fascinating, because today's topic was moving the entire system and how we leverage educators' voices in moving that system. And the fascinating thing about Helen Keller, as I thought about this morning, is I did not know this. Helen Keller was born sighted. She was a typical child. She could read, she could see, she could see, she could speak, she could hear. And then when she was 2, she got this terrible fever. And the result of the fever was that afterwards she had lost all those sensibilities. So she knew what it was to have a voice, to be sighted, to be able to speak, to be able to communicate. And then suddenly she was in this world where when she wanted someone to hold her, no one held her. And when she wanted someone to feed her, no one fed her. And when she wanted someone to leave her alone, no one left her alone. And she suddenly became this impossibly angry child. The reason they went to Annie Sullivan was she was so violent that it was not safe in their home. She was throwing chairs, she was breaking things, because she suffered under this incredible weight of not being able to find her voice. And Annie Sullivan, if you know, Annie Sullivan, who was her great teacher, had been blind once as well. She had been blind, and her sight had improved enough that she learned to read. So she knew the feeling of what it meant to be cut off. And she eventually teaches Helen how to do Braille, how to read people's lips. And what happens? What happens is it unleashes this insatiable appetite in this little girl who now has a voice again. She now has impact again, and what was before frustration is now just fueled for change. She goes on to write 12 books. She becomes the first deaf and blind person to ever graduate with a bachelor's degree. Right? But what happened is she knew what it was like to have a voice, and then she lost it. And when she found it again, she never felt so powerful. And the reason why I think about that is when people talk a lot about what makes teaching the hardest profession in the world, in my mind, what makes it the hardest profession is there is no profession in which you know the power of your own voice more awesomely than you do in your own classroom, and no profession in where you feel the loss of your own voice more powerfully than when you walk out of your own classroom. And having to live with that dichotomy where you know you have the insight to change people's lives every day, and yet you walk out of that classroom and you can't get the attention of folks whose job it is to understand your work. That is what makes this work impossible, sometimes. But the power is that you are the Annie Sullivan character here. You spend your entire lives knowing what it means to give young people a voice. You can't then step away from your own obligation to make sure you develop yours. And your own obligation to make sure it's heard and understood and manifested in the policies at your local school board or your local state or your federal elected officials, not because it's going to make you feel better, but because our system cannot succeed without that clarity. And what you find is without you finding that voice, you end up in a place like Helen, which is you just feel frustrated that people aren't listening. And I think it is your moment to take that back. The country needs you to do it, but you have to stand up to do it. And so every time you look at one of your own kids and want to ensure that they have the voice to be heard, know that as important as that is you having your own voice to be heard. Can you give a huge round of applause to our panelists who came here today? Thanks so much for being here and have a great day.